Okay, I'm Andy Biemiller. I've been working for some years on the problem of what words you're going to teach if you're going to address teaching vocabulary. So we're going to teach vocabulary, what are we going to teach? Just right at the beginning, let's see, why should we worry about vocabulary? What's the big deal? The truth is that the size of a child's vocabulary in kindergarten is the best predictor of children's reading comprehension from grade 3 and anything you're trying to predict after grade 3 from kindergarten. It doesn't predict grade 1 and 2 so well, because there it's a question of how they're putting together their decoding and word identification skills. But essentially, once they have a reasonable handle on that, what makes the big difference is if you know a lot of words, you're in good shape, you're at grade level or above, and you're off to the races. And if not, you're in trouble. So you'll get kids who've been looking like they're doing well in second or even third grade, and you get something called the fourth grade slump, which is when they begin to realize they're not understanding the books they have to read. Their problem is not much different from my problem when I read German. My vocabulary is this big. Okay. You'll notice I often talk about word meanings rather than words. People keep saying kids have so many words to learn. What kids have are so many word meanings to learn, and particularly at the lower level, the early learned vocabulary, most of the words have 2 or 3 different meanings. So you really need to attend to whether they know meanings. There are some examples. I'm going to talk a little bit about how much vocabulary are we really talking about. The hard figure that we have is how many kids, the average kids, know around the end of second grade, beginning of third grade. And our answer is about 6,000 root words, root word meanings. That's what we're trying to talk about here. A number of different researchers have pretty much agree on that, 6,000, 6,500 as probably the number of meanings that are typically known at that point. Furthermore, to a very substantial degree, English-speaking kids, I cannot speak firmly about others, but I suspect it's the same, know pretty much the same words. Now, when I say that pretty much, 4,000 or 5,000 of the words are going to be the same, and some will be different. The other problem is that by the time you get to grade 2, to the end of grade 2, kids have the lowest quarter, the average vocabulary known by the kids in the lowest quartile is about 4,000. The kids in the top quartile, it's about 8,000. So there's a huge range by grade 2. Now, we talk a great deal about kids building up their wonderful vocabularies as a result of reading. And I think it is true that after grade 2, a great deal of vocabulary is acquired through reading. And in fact, I even have some data that suggests to me that even kids who are starting out with fairly small vocabularies, now start to add words at a similar rate, namely about 1,000 words a year. There seems to be less variation on that than there is on how they got to grade 2. I think that's because in the first, up through grade 2, the vocabulary that children have is very much determined by the opportunities they had to learn words in their homes, in their home community, and in verbal talk in school. They really are not by grade 2, or many of them are not reading enough to be encountering a lot of new words in the books they read. Their new words are coming from elsewhere. If we want kids to learn a lot of words in kindergarten, grade 1, and grade 2, it's got to come from a more concerted effort by teachers. In your handout, you have a copy of that table. Okay. There have been a number of people who have experimented with teaching vocabulary in the primary grades, or even in nursery school. all of the studies I have seen, I'm certainly not claiming this is the only way, I'm simply saying the studies I've been able to find generally involve reading stories, texts, but mostly stories, to children, and explaining words from the stories that you're reading. If you try to teach words just, here's a list of 15 words for today, it is not an effective way, as reported by various people. You really need to teach words in relation to some meaningful context that the kids are tuning into. Using such methods, they've been done by a number of people, again, including myself, for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And what we find is that it is reasonable to expect that kids will actually acquire 400 meanings in the course of a year. And that's talking about the school, 40 weeks of school, 10 words a week. What we can say we really know is that they can learn 10 words a week over 4 weeks, and they retain them for some time after that. You need some continued involvement with them, they're going to retain them forever. As long as you're planning the words that you're teaching, that would add to the vocabulary that they're learning at home. Successful programs have been reported in a number of studies. Typically we're taking about 30 minutes a day to do this, 5 days a week. Success meant they were retaining 2 or 3 meanings per day, or about 10 a week. You could get a little more if you're lucky, but you have to teach a lot more than the number of words that each individual child learns. The best we've gotten has been about retaining 40% of the words that were taught. The kids are actually retaining 50% or more of the words they didn't know before, but one of the factors in the fact you have to teach a lot of words is that this child knows that word, this child doesn't. Well, the one has an opportunity to learn it, the one doesn't because he already knows it. That's one of the reasons. Another reason that there's variation is simply every study that reports on this simply says some of the words don't get picked up. Even if they weren't well known at the beginning, some words don't seem to move much. I would wish I could tell you that people like Isabel Beck and McEwen and myself could tell you why certain words aren't being learned. We can't. My best suspicion is that the teaching of that particular word wasn't very good, but I also suspect there may be, and I simply throw this out as a thought, an absolute limit as to how many new words a child can add in one day. That may seem simple-minded, and it may not be right. Notice, by the way, that second language children, the children who are speaking Turkish, say, and now they're learning in German. Clearly, in certain situations, you'd have to say they're learning words faster than that. But I think the words that they are learning are words that they already know the meaning in their first language, and that is a different situation than learning a new meaning from cold. Okay. When we teach kids to decode, if we've once done it, the kids are off to the races and they can use it the rest of their lives, like riding a bicycle. If they have learned to compute, to add numbers and subtract numbers, they can use that for the rest of their lives. You don't have to keep teaching that every year. Vocabulary, you have to keep teaching each year, especially in the primary years, where there may be more inference from books. The rate of inference actually goes up between grade 3 and grade 9. At grade 9, they're better at inferring word meanings than they are at grade 3. At grade 3, they aren't very good at all. And generally speaking, inferring a word that you have heard in the middle of somebody talking is a lot harder to deal with than a word you might encounter if you're reading a book and you encounter a word you don't know. You can stop and do something about that. You can't do that when you're listening to someone else. Or you can mark it and go back to it. There's a bunch of things you can do as a reader that you cannot do as a listener. So the listener is relatively more dependent on somebody else explaining what a word means. Generally, as I said, this involved reading a story. Typically, most of the people who succeeded with this, reading a story more than once, and then on each reading you might teach 7 to 10 meanings on that one. We have learned if we added to that a review at the end of, pardon? At the end of it, you review it again, then we reviewed it again at the end of the week. When we did that, we got 40% retained, which was better than anyone else had gotten. Most people are getting 25 or 30%. So a little extra review helps. But I wish I could tell you that we worked this out with great theories. The teachers we were working with suggested those changes that greatly improved the results. What meaning should we teach? Here we've said we have an idea how many words, what words. My very strong opinion is that the words to teach are the words that are in the sequence that kids are learning. Kids learn words in a sequence. So if you have a kid who's back here in the sequence, another one's up here, the words you want to teach are in here. We find those with a very crude method. We tested, for example, a whole lot of kids at the end of second grade or the end of third grade. And we looked for the words that in effect are known at the end of second grade between 40 and 80%. Meanings are known better than 80%. Kids are getting, without a lot of help. The kids are known below 40%. And that's just an arbitrary line, obviously, that we've put into it. We're saying worry about them later. The words in between are the words that the kids with large vocabularies know and the kids with small vocabularies don't know. That, in essence, is what we were looking for. And that our strategy is simply to look for those. One example, as I say up there, is, and we actually have that kind of data, you've got 3 kids who know 7,000 words, one of them in first grade, one in third grade, one in fifth grade. About 80–90% of the words are the same words. It shows you they're just, whether they're moving through the sequence fast or moving through the sequence slow, you're getting the same, they're picking up the same word. Certain words get picked up at certain points in the sequence. It would be nice if we knew better than we do why. Isabel Beck is well known as the most widely read book on teaching vocabulary. And she suggested this tier system of same as I'm just suggesting. We don't worry about the easy words. We don't worry about the really difficult words that are going to get picked up in more specific context, like teaching chemistry or something. And it's the words in between that are going to be of general use that will be good. The only catch, and in general, if you were talking about kids from third grade up, generally speaking, I simply agree with her. I wouldn't argue about which words, kinds of words she's talking about. She hasn't published a list. I have. But she hasn't. But basically, what the words she's talking about, I would agree, above third grade. Before third grade, there are a whole lot of words that she's suggesting are simply, kids acquire them automatically, the first 7,000 words. Not true. There's a whole lot of those words that are certainly not learned by the end of grade 2, by the beginning of the period when kids really become dependent on knowing vocabulary to understand books. And so, frankly, we're saying there's a whole lot of those words that are a high priority. I've published a book called Words Worth Teaching, in which those 1,600 words are marked out. They're actually labeled as T2, meaning teach by grade 2. The same book has another listing of words with particular priority for the between grade 3 and grade 6. I'm not trying to say this word must be taught in grade 3 and this must be taught in grade 4. I think rather you should be taking advantage of the context that you're using to teach words. However, you want to make sure that you're picking up on these words as you go across those periods, the primary period, the upper elementary period. There are some examples, and there's more examples in your handout. If the kids are going to succeed in the upper elementary grades, a lot of them are going to need more vocabulary than they're getting now. We know that it's still the case that a whole lot of kids get to upper elementary grades and they fizzle. even if they've done all right with their reading skills. In fact, often we send them out for, remedial reading, and it turns out, if you look at them carefully, actually they can decode fine. Their problem is that they don't know what the words mean. And in that case, that's what you ought to be working on. But it also, unless we really start picking up on that issue for less advantaged kids, by age 4 or 5, really by age 4, you'd have a serious chance of getting them to the point by the end of grade 2, but they have at least an average size vocabulary. What about before kindergarten? A lot of words that we've identified even in our book as quote, easy, but are not necessarily easy in the sense of did the kids know them at the beginning of kindergarten. And again, you can identify a group of words, but the kids with big vocabularies know by the beginning of kindergarten, and that the kids with small vocabularies don't. I wish I could tell you I had the kind of hard data I have for further up the line on that. I don't. On the one hand, testing words is testing word meanings is a lot harder at age 5 than it is at age 8. So just on a straight eyeball kind of an approach, I've identified 1,000 words that I think are good candidates for early instruction. Here at Waterford, the people at Waterford are presently trying to develop computerized methods for teaching vocabulary to 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And together, they and I have been trying to conduct some research to answer the questions, which word should we really concentrate on in such an effort? Unfortunately, we have been unable to obtain funding thus far. I think we'll continue to look. There are some examples of what I consider to be early words. Notice gentle, 2 meanings. In the previous listing, I also put in some like that. The issue here is the number of meanings, not the number of words. Okay. Even within that framework, are there some words that are more worth teaching than others? And I am suggesting, and this is the first time I've talked publicly about the research, that so-called verbally defined meanings may be more important than concrete meanings. There are some examples. Courage, peace, think, memory. Each of those, maybe not memory. The other 3 are words that certainly the children with larger vocabularies at age 5 know, and the kids with smaller vocabularies are likely not to know. Concrete words refers to something that you can point to. Computer, person, table. My hunch is these are things that are really, to some extent, known or understood even by children who don't have a spoken word for them, but from their interaction with the physical world. Verbally defined meanings refer to words that must be defined or explained, at least in part, with other words, and with a kind of shared experience between 2 people. Think, because, maybe. I found that I had 2 sets of data that allowed me to make a minor test of the validity that verbally defined words may be more important. I had data on a lot of meanings these kids knew, and a year later I had reading comprehension data. So I had data on kindergarten kids, and they're reading in first grade vocabulary, 2nd grade reading comprehension, so forth up to 4th grade. Across that data set, we found that the knowledge of the verbally defined meanings, just about 30 of them in this particular run, but they were quite randomly selected, predicted 55% of reading comprehension the next year. If we used concrete meanings, we had about the same number of words. They knew it only predicted about 40%, and they were entirely subsumed into the other data. Those taken separately didn't add any variance at all. So that if you just knew how they were doing with a sample of verbally defined meanings, you had a better prediction. By the way, notice that any vocabulary test, where the vocabulary test is an oral test, as these were, and you're then testing that against reading comprehension, you get a substantial correlation, such as the kind of thing we're seeing here, but you don't get as high a one as you get if you look at some of the standardized reading tests like the Iowa test or the CTBS. We had correlation 90 between the vocabulary tested, in that subsequent grade and the reading comprehension in the subsequent grade, but those were both reading tests. And so it correlated both the vocabulary and their reading skill. And so it exaggerates how much of an association there is because it includes both. But the true vocabulary gave you much of the story. So to summarize, size of children's vocabulary is a major predictor of later educational success. There was a 4-year difference amongst the kids. I remember I said 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, and they learn 1,000 a year, so they're 4 years apart. We do have a pretty good guess as to what some of those words should be. I'm not going to say that's rocket science, that we know exactly this word and not that one. But we're saying, I think if you want a basis for, you've got to make some kind of decision. You can only teach so many words. How are you going to do it? I think you want to find some kind of a list approach. It appears to me possible for kids to learn enough words across a 4-year period to get disadvantaged kids in a reasonably good shape by the end of grade 2, by the end of the primary grades, if we spend half an hour a day on vocabulary. But boy, trying to talk teachers into doing that is a good trick. I'm going to say 2 more things, knowing I'm about the end of my time. One is that it's been very hard for teachers to test vocabulary in the primary grades, and I suspect that that's one reason why it hasn't had the attention. Neither the standardized tests nor the other classroom work can do it. Actually, Kearns and I have recently developed a method. I certainly wouldn't claim it was 100% accurate, but it's accurate enough where you ask, for a particular word, you put it in a sentence, you ask a question, can a cow run faster than a horse? Now notice it involves knowledge of cows and horses and so forth. You say you're testing cow, you're actually also testing horse. And the answer you're looking for is no. Well, surprisingly, an awful lot of kids can answer that question correctly. But that's a question like that, it's just, 50-50 chance. So you have to ask at least 2 questions about each word you're testing to see if they're getting. Then you've got 1 chance out of 4 if you're saying they have to be right on both questions. We published that, it's in the Journal of Education. The other thing I want to say is, I'd love to tell you that if we would teach all that vocabulary, a lot of kids would be home free, they'd be at grade level. We don't know that. Nobody has taught that volume of vocabulary over several years. And until somebody makes a serious effort to do that, we won't know how much good that will do. What we know is that with poor vocabulary, they don't do well. That's a safe bet. And so I suggest it's time to get on with teaching vocabulary. Thank you very much.
Questions? Andy, go ahead and you can select.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. One is, in the early childhood classroom, often by pre-K and definitely in kindergarten, you're starting to look at Dolch words, the 100 highest frequency words, and you're looking at them for fluency. So did you find that all the teaching of vocabulary versus the teaching of fluency-based words, because they're 2 different aspects of literacy development, come
I
into
think
contact?
fluency is vastly overrated, to be honest. And I've done a lot of research on reading speed. Frankly, if you measure how fast they can read letters, by 2nd grade you get a pretty decent prediction of their reading comprehension. The problem is that fluency, other than just for the basic letter speed, which is an individual, and which kind of wipes out after a couple more years. In other words, everyone is fast enough, to put it bluntly, in terms of their basic ability to go fast. The variation in their reading speed tends to be a function of, do they know the words? If they will read a bunch of unfamiliar words a lot slower than they will read a bunch of familiar words. They will read complicated sentences slower than they will read simple sentences. They will read sentences a lot faster than the same words arranged out of sentences. Bluntly, like I say, I think fluency is greatly exaggerated, and we should concentrate on vocabulary. And reasonable we should teach decoding. Don't teach decoding, they're sunk too. But once they've got decoding, you've got to get on with the vocabulary.
Second question is, I think the parent component's a pretty big indicator of success as well for children, especially 0 to 5, because so many children don't necessarily go to early childhood programs, depending on socioeconomic status, experiences in the home, level of books in the in their homes, level of reading, just level of interaction, vocabulary development is also a huge predictor. Did you see in your research, or did you indicate anything related to that children's growth rates in vocabulary are different depending on their economic status as well?
We certainly know that the early on vocabulary is less. I haven't done it, but Hart and Risley, just I think cited in the book you've got there, and other sources, show dramatic differences in the vocabulary the kids have, and dramatic differences in the amount of words the kids ever hear at home, much less which words and how many. That is exactly why I keep saying, you're not going to succeed in talking everyone in the homes to do a decent job. And decent job is not just even reading to kids. Just reading to kids without some attention to vocabulary doesn't have much impact on vocabulary. So if you really want to boost up vocabulary, you need to stop and just casually explain what a word means here and there when the opportunity presents itself, meaning in a context. And that is what is not happening. I suspect that you would find two other things. In the disadvantaged home, the parents, not only in the case of reading, but in other cases, stopping to explain what a word means, which I think occurs more often in more advantaged homes. And secondly, what happens when the child asks, what does a word mean? It won't take many cases of don't bother me to turn that off. And conversely, if you encourage asking about words, it will tend to increase and become more common. And that's both something we should be doing very actively in daycare centers, early childhood programs, or what have you. Obviously, we should be encouraging parents to do all that too.
Graphic organizers are becoming the expectation in all classrooms, kindergarten all the way through. What did you find as an impact on graphic organizers in the teaching of vocabulary?
I've never seen any research on that. I mean, I know people have been experimenting with it, run small experiments that show that it helps. I know nothing of its practice in classrooms. I know that if you went back, the data that I have now is about 10 years old, not mine, but 3 other studies by people who weren't connected to each other all replicated the same result, which was that a year of kindergarten, first grade, or second grade had absolutely no measurable impact on vocabulary growth. So at that time, damn little was being done. The method of showing that was to compare the vocabulary sizes of children who were, the oldest kindergartners and the youngest first graders, whatever the appropriate ages for that district were. Whereas the kid who'd had a year of first grade but was only a month older than the kindergartner would be considerably better at decoding, considerably better at computation, and not 1 month better in vocabulary on average. So that the year of schooling had not impacted it at all. What's going on now, I don't know, but I don't think. More recent reports also indicate no overt serious vocabulary teaching. Yes, we teach the names of the months and the letters, and maybe in the course of the year we teach 100 words and think we're doing vocabulary. But the fact is we need to teach 1,000 words in the course of a school year if we really want to move the kids who are really in need of more vocabulary.
We have time for just one more question.
Could you speculate a bit about the role of technology in teaching vocabulary? Would it have an added value? Would it be more efficient? And how?
Yeah. Pure speculation. I have great hopes for programs like the ones that they're experimenting with here. I know of a person who's working on this kind of issue in Pittsburgh, at Carnegie. I know there are people elsewhere that are experimenting with computer approaches for teaching vocabulary. I have yet to see results. And I look forward to that, both here and elsewhere.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.